Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our stakeholder meeting. My name is Brenda Kern on behalf of the stakeholder group. We are welcoming you to a California ISO meeting. Today, we'll go over a few housekeeping reminders as this call is being recorded for informational and community purposes only. Any related transcriptions should not be reprinted without the ISO's permission. And we will also want to, if you have any technical issues, please send them to our Inteller events. She'll be on there to help. But also we'll go over some instructions on raising your hand to ask a question. The raise hand icon is located when you press the participant and chat panel. So it will be on the bottom right of your screen. Also, if you're just dialed in to the phone line, *3 will be the way to get added to the queue. As a reminder, make sure you state your full name and affiliation before making a comment. And also, we welcome all questions through chat and verbal. And also, make sure you send any questions to all panelists, and we will be able to respond to those throughout the call. And then, so I will let Amelia introduce our panelist group here we have here today. We have and then after that, we'll get things started. And go ahead, Amelia. You're on mute, just want to make sure. You go to the next slide, Silas. Thank you.
Thank you, Brenda. Thank you, Silas, and thank you, everybody, for being here today. It is my great pleasure to announce that we're, to start with the inclusion of the Western Energy Imbalance Market Regional Issues Forum Annual Policy Initiatives Catalog and Roadmap 2024. That roundtable report to the WEIM governing body summarizes the by sector within the Regional Issues Forum, the prioritized initiatives of those represented stakeholders in that body. We have one of the chairs of RIF here with us today who will be presenting that initiative shortly. That is followed by a set of discretionary initiative proposals, which each in their own way have to do with the WEIM. This is the second working group to feature presentations of proposed initiatives by the entities that have proposed them. It really allows those entities to explain the submitted initiative and really dig into the impact of the proposed change on the market, addressing the benefits and distribution of benefits, potentially any costs, and the overall impact to market efficiency and reliability. Make a case for each of those initiatives. You go to the next slide. The issues we're going to be speaking to today and the entities who are speaking are all listed on our agenda. I anticipate we should be able to start at about 1:45 following the presentation of the RIF report with operational enhancements in the WEIM, a set of 3 presentations by BPA, the change to the WEIM resource sufficiency evaluation proposed by multiple stakeholders. There's a note afterwards that will be presented by the ISO today. Bidding rules on external WEIM interties. This was a proposal that was promoted by the IPP, the power producers sector within the RIF. It will be presented today by Gridwell. I wanted to highlight, I do not have a presentation at this moment, but if the representative from Gridwell would chat the producer on the call, we can make sure that we're able to give you the structure you need to present that. Following that will be a couple of very well-documented proposals submitted by SRP, and unfortunately SRP was also not able to be with us today to do that presentation, so the ISO will be covering that for them. Next slide. Before I hand it off for the RIF, just like to highlight that it is the discussion today that we found valuable, at least in the first working group. So please do feel free to raise your hand and make a comment as we move through the presentation, both of the RIF and of the potential discretionary initiative. Forward to hearing from you all. And with that, thank you, Meg, for being with us today.
Of course. Thanks very much, Amelia, and thanks to the ISO for very kindly agreeing to host the RIF at this meeting. My name is Meg McNall. I am a sector liaison to the RIF from the California ISO Participating Transmission Owner sector, and I am also serving as chair of the RIF this year. And I'm going to give an overview of the report that the Regional Issues Forum Liaison Group prepared following our first annual roadmap, policy initiatives catalog and roadmap roundtable discussion that we held at the CAISO's offices during the RIF meeting on March 18th. Just to level set a little bit, what I'm going to do is walk through at a high level some of the major conclusions set forth in the report, and then detail again in a very summary fashion some of the input that each of the sectors provided during that roundtable discussion and is outlined in the report. If you have specific questions about individual topics that each of the sectors identified, I would really recommend that you take a look at the report itself. And there's also a good deal of information posted in the slide presentations from the March 18th meeting, and that recording obviously is publicly available as well. And then at the end, I will provide contact information for each of the sector liaisons. So please feel free to reach out to any of the sector representatives directly if you have questions, comments, or feedback on any of what we've outlined in the report and we'll discuss today. So if we can go to the next slide here, this is just a bit of history and background about what the roundtable is and what we are trying to accomplish with this roundtable discussion. So in the final proposal for Western EIM governance review in phase 3, which was approved by the CAISO Board of Governors and the governing body in February of 2023. There were a number of topics that were addressed, obviously, but one of them was the continuing role for stakeholders in the ISO policy initiatives process under an EDAM type of governance structure. And the Governance Review Committee provided for an expanded role of the RIF in the process that the ISO uses to prioritize discretionary policy initiatives. So as we've talked about at earlier stages of the CAISO's 2024 policy catalog and roadmap process, the ISO has different categories of initiatives, some of which are required to meet a regulatory or a market policy need. And then there's a category of discretionary initiatives that stakeholders are requesting and recommending the ISO take on as a way of addressing a problem in the ISO's markets and the operation of the ISO controlled grid, initiatives that stakeholders believe would provide an improvement in the existing rules. So the way in which this was to be accomplished was through a discussion at a RIF meeting in the form of a roundtable, whereby each individual sector would present information regarding priorities for policy initiatives by that sector. And there would be some give and take discussion of each policy priority to allow for the identification of common priorities that cross sectors. So throughout 2023, the RIF liaisons discussed ways in which we might go about implementing the roundtable process. And we worked very closely with the CAISO team to come up with a structure that would allow our roundtable to take place at a point in the policy initiatives catalog and roadmap development process where our input could reasonably be accommodated. So in working with the ISO, we determined that sometime relatively early in the process would be most constructive, so the ISO would have the opportunity to fully consider the RIF's input. And if we can go to the next slide. So as mentioned, we had our first roundtable meeting on March 18th. It was a hybrid meeting. There were attendees in person and on the web. And for those stakeholders in attendance, we really appreciate all of the input that was provided both at the roundtable itself and before the meeting to your sector representatives. So during the discussion, liaisons for each sector presented that sector level input that was contemplated in the GRC's final proposal and discussed the way in which that sector sort of developed its input. And that looked a little different for each of the sectors. We have a wide range in the composition of sectors, which with several of them being relatively large and including a number of stakeholders that may have slightly different interests, located in different regions geographically. And we have sectors that are more narrow. And so the process for obtaining input from sectors was a little bit different for each, and we talked a bit about that at the roundtable meeting. We also had the opportunity to synthesize priorities across the sector, and you see that reflected in our report and in some of the priority topics that I'll get to in a second. And we also had the chance, and we're very grateful to hear from representatives on behalf of the BOSR, the Western EIM governing body, and ISO management. And once again, very appreciative of those who participated in the form of public comments. Following our meeting, we did publish our formal report, and that is available on the Western EIM website on the Regional Issues Forum page. There's a link in my slides, and I'm happy to put a link in the chat as well if that's not something that attendees at this meeting have seen. I think the report follows pretty closely the themes and topics that were discussed among the sectors at the roundtable meeting. And so our goal as sector liaisons was that there not really be any surprises to anyone in the written report itself. We think it aligns pretty well with what we discussed and what we heard from stakeholders at our March meeting. Next slide, please. So in terms of common themes across the sectors, several sectors express support for continuing certain CAISO initiatives that are ongoing. We note that in 2023, the ISO initiated and has continued working very hard on initiatives, including those addressing enhancements to price formation, greenhouse gas coordination, gas resource management, and resource adequacy modeling and program design. And there is cross-cutting support among the sectors for the ISO's ongoing work in those initiatives. In certain instances, there were sectors who did expand, for example, on support for particular topics within those initiatives. For example, there obviously is continued support for the consideration of scarcity pricing, for example, within the price formation initiative, and that's obviously a critical topic there. I think, and this is to some extent my own observation, but I think it was widely discussed during our roundtable. There is interest among the RIF liaisons and the sectors in understanding more about the process through which the ISO will transition working group phases of initiatives into the policy development stage. And we understand and acknowledge that that to some extent is a work in progress as the ISO looks to continue to implement its working group process, which is relatively new from within the past couple of years. And so that's something that I think a number of sectors had perspectives on. In terms of an additional topic where there was very strong support for consideration of an issue, this relates to a sub-issue within the Price Formation Enhancements Initiative having to do with the bidding rules for above the soft offer cap that's applicable in ISO markets for non-generator resources, specifically energy storage resources and hydroelectric resources. The same concern was also raised to some extent for PDR, proxy demand resources. The ISO has heard that feedback and has, as probably most of you on this call are aware, has initiated a process to expedite consideration of solutions to this set of issues, both for potential implementation this summer and on a longer term basis. So that, given that it's in the policy development phase as we walk through the sector specific feedback, we didn't include that particular item in each sector slides, but there was wide support for that. Next slide, please. All right. So in terms of what we are thinking of as new policy initiatives, some of these are actually re-engagement on policy initiatives that had maybe started a year or two or a year or more ago, but that are where there's interest in perhaps re-engaging on a scope of topics. And the categories where we observe the sectors have interest include a few topics that I think we're going to talk about later today. But there is interest in restarting a initiative related to the resource sufficiency evaluation. This may encompass re-engagement on phase 3 of the RSE Enhancements Initiative, or I don't think anyone's wedded to the concept of whether there's a new initiative that starts or a continuation of a prior initiative in a new phase, but there is wide interest there. There is interest in, and this is one where I think we are going to talk about this a bit later, but there's some cross-sector interest in understanding more and potentially changing rules related to intertie trading, including under EDAM. Several sectors are interested in assorted changes to the transmission planning process. Again, either under the scope of the previously initiated Transmission Planning Process Enhancements Initiative or in the form of a new initiative. And then finally, there was a lot of sector interest in issues related to demand response, participation in markets by demand response resources, and refinement of rules related to reliability demand response. Next slide, please. And then in terms of topics that are not particularized to a single initiative, but represent kind of consideration of more thematic, broader issues, a number of sectors encourage consideration of issues around the management of themes with respect to market policy and design as we look to have potentially multiple market models active within the WEC footprint. There is interest in ensuring that there's consideration of issues around themes to hopefully enable market participants to manage kind of these dual market models effectively and efficiently. There is interest in further consideration of the ISO's roles as the market operator for the Western EIM and the EDAM footprint, as well as its role as the balancing authority and transmission operator for the sort of traditional BAA footprint, CAISO-controlled grid section of that market, and wanting to ensure that there is clarity and that stakeholders understand when the ISO is acting in its capacity as the market operator versus when it may be taking actions or expressing a position in its capacity as the BA or as the transmission operator. And then finally, consideration of governance and governance-related rules and structures continues to be a theme where there is wide sector interest. And then one thing that this kind of dovetails to some extent with the dual rules of the ISO, but one thing that we heard from a couple of sectors, including the one that I represent, is a need to appropriately balance initiatives that are focused on the Western EIM and the EDAM against initiatives such as, for example, the Resource Adequacy Modeling and Program Design Initiative that is more oriented toward rules that are applicable just to the CAISO footprint. And so, you know, as a PTO sector representative, obviously, my sector's perspective is that both of those are important. And speaking on behalf of the sector, I think we're very appreciative that other sectors acknowledge this as well. We have market participants in a number of sectors that are both inside and outside the ISO. And so there's recognition that we have to balance our resources and our priorities. Next slide, please. All right. So this might be a good place to pause and see if there are any questions before I move into just a quick overview of the different sector-specific priorities. And if there are no questions, I can go ahead and move forward. All right. I am not hearing or seeing anything. So in terms of the Western EIM entity sector, so these are the non-CAISO EIM participants, and the sector liaisons are Lindsay Schleckaway from NV Energy and Josh Walter from Seattle City Light. That sector has identified, obviously, continuation of several key initiatives, including price formation, GHG coordination, and gas resource management. There is support for starting new initiatives, again, related to the resource sufficiency evaluation, demand response, storage, metering, settlement, and resource modeling and dispatch. And obviously, that's a extensive list of topics, and they're quite thoroughly outlined in the EIM entity sector materials. So if you're interested in seeing specific proposals within that set of topics, be sure to take a look at our report and our posted presentation from the March 18th meeting. The EIM entities are encouraging the ISO to think about ways where there might be greater clarity on how effective and efficient this new catalog and roadmap process is. We as a group, I think, are very encouraged that the ISO is placing such a great emphasis on stakeholder prioritization and hearing from stakeholders about priorities. And so the sector is interested in hearing how the ISO and stakeholders can understand and appreciate how that feedback is translating into what actually results in new initiatives. So, and then finally, there is interest in ensuring that there's a process in place to address topics that are urgent. Next slide, please. All right, so this is the California ISO PTO sector. And the PTO sector had a number of proposals for new initiatives related to reform of sort of discrete market design rules around ancillary services participation, DR enhancements, and then also had a couple of ideas for broader stakeholder topics, including topics around the integration of long duration energy storage in markets and concerns and consideration of issues around CAISO, BAA, reliability, including consideration of issues related to day ahead self-scheduling within the CAISO and the EIM markets. And finally, there is support for a new initiative related to the calculation and allocation of maximum import capability, which is a sort of form or proxy for deliverability for imported RA resources. There's interest in seeing if there are approaches that might allow for an expansion of MIC to enable more import RA. Next slide, please. So from among the consumer-owned utilities, this is utilities that are traditionally considered public power. There are COUs both inside and outside the ISO footprint. This sector supports continuation of a number of existing initiatives, including price formation, GHG coordination, gas resource management, and RA. There's also support for, and I think this falls in the category of either a new initiative or continuation of a prior initiative, but related to storage enhancements. This sector supports new initiatives related to transmission planning. And again, I think this is one where maybe it's a continuation of an initiative that started in the past under the TPP enhancements, or perhaps it's a new initiative related to topics around transmission planning. This sector also emphasizes consideration of seams within multiple initiatives and delineation of the CAISO's role. And finally, the COU sector has a lot of creative suggestions around potential process improvements and areas for clarifying stakeholder processes and potentially enabling stakeholders to have a better understanding of things such as when the ISO decides not to pursue an issue in a stakeholder process, for example. Next slide, please. So I think we are hearing from a representative on behalf of the IPP and marketer sector. This is a very large sector. I think during the meeting it was 70 plus members, and that may have increased in the last couple of months, but there were a number of topics that the IPP and marketer sector is interested in seeing the CAISO take up, including intertie bidding rules, resource sufficiency, continuing with price formation, addressing market clearing prices during contingency events, which is characterized as an issue that is under consideration now. And then this sector also provided support for various new initiatives, including an initiative focused on improvements and enhancements to stakeholder processes, various topics around energy storage, GHG functionality improvements, consideration of issues around load conformance and intertie transactions, and then finally, again, transmission planning process enhancements. Next slide, please. So the public interest organization and consumer advocate sector proposed a number of suggested recommendations around the transmission planning process, and specifically the competitive solicitation process component of the TPP. And there were also suggestions for enhancements to rules related to RDRRs in the ISO. And finally, this sector is supportive of continuing consideration of seams-related issues. Next slide, please. And then this is the last of our sectors. This is the PMA sector, including BPA and WAPA. And the PMA sector, again, supports continuation of price formation, GHG initiatives, and re-engaging on resource efficiency evaluation issues. And this sector also supports implementation of an initiative to improve operational and settlement functionality, and there are recommendations that are set forth in our report addressing topics such as dispute resolution and how sort of unexpected or anomalous market outcomes are addressed. There's a request within that topic to consider dual submittals of base schedules and the ability of an EIM, Western EIM entity to set limits for dynamic and static ETSRs. And I would recommend stakeholders to the report to understand more details about what the proposal there is. And then finally, the PMA sector is also supportive of considering issues around themes. Next slide. So just to wrap up here, I am happy to answer any questions, but our next steps as the RIF will include continuing to monitor the policy initiatives catalog and roadmap process and provide input to the ISO where that would be useful, and to work with the ISO staff to identify areas where we might consider some improvements to the roundtable process for next year. And by the same token, I think we'd be very interested in hearing from stakeholders on whether any of you have ideas for how we can make the roundtable process better, more responsive, whether there are opportunities for expanded stakeholder input into that, and any other ideas you may have. Next slide, please. I think this might be my last one. Yep. And then my last slide has, just for reference, contact information for the various sector liaisons. So again, if you do have thoughts or ideas or would like to provide input or feedback on the report that we've published, feel free to get in touch with your sector liaison. I'm hoping that you already know who that is, but if you don't, we're all listed there. So thanks. And if there are questions or points of discussion, I'm happy to address those. And I don't see any hands. And it looks like Brenda has put links in the chat to both the contact information for the sector liaisons and to our RIF page on the EIM website. So that's extremely helpful. Thank you very much. And so if there are no questions or comments, I'm happy to give this back to Amelia.
Chair McNall, thank you very, very much. Appreciate the review, and appreciate also that you're ending a little bit early. That gives me an opportunity. Yeah, it gives me an opportunity to explain a little bit about, frame for everybody a little bit about the process. This is the first year that we're running through a new stakeholder prioritization of discretionary initiatives. As Chair McNall noted, you really are welcome to submit comments now on the process itself. We're looking to make improvements in that process, especially around things like timing and stages. The first working group, which occurred on April 22nd for stakeholder prioritization, included a description of the process for each of the submitted initiatives. what we did is split them into 4 categories. There were proposals that are part of an ongoing process. There are proposals that are essentially not optional for the ISO, things that really are absolutely required for the ISO to continue to work on. There are also process improvements, which can include increased transparency, more reporting, all kinds of things, all kinds of suggestions that would make the market function more efficiently for participants, but that do not rise to the level of requiring a discretionary initiative. And finally, there are a whole set of discretionary initiatives. It is these discretionary initiatives that we'll be discussing in the next section of the presentation today. For each potential discretionary initiative, there will be a short presentation that is accompanied by slides, but it's also backed by the submitted comments from the initiative supporters who initially submitted it. We will, after the third and final of these meetings, have a wrap-up meeting at which we explain the commenting prioritization template and give stakeholders in the community a chance to rank for the ISO their concerns. The ISO will then take those ranked concerns, and that will serve as an input to 2 things. One is an input to the policy roadmap for new initiatives, essentially starting in that we will submit to the board towards the end of November or early December. And the second thing, and I wanted to highlight this, is it's as an expression of the initiatives and the work that is important to our market participants. It really will serve to inform the ISO's corporate strategic goals going forward. So I thank you all for being here. Thank you all for presenting your initiatives. You're making a case for them. We assume that everybody will support their own initiative as it moves through the process, but the goal is always to gather the support of others. So with that, if you would move to the next slide. We're starting out today with a set of 3 presentations from PA, and I believe they have been, I believe the first presentation is from David Silver, who is on the panelist list. So with that, I will hand it over to Mr. Silver. Thank you for being here today. We could check your audio.
If you're on the panelist list, you should be able to unmute yourself and speak.
Let me see if I can fix my audio.
Oh, all right.
Is that any better?
Yeah, you're coming through clear on my end.
Okay, great. Thank you. My name is David Silver. I'm with Bonneville Power Administration. I work in operations with the connection between our AGC systems and EIM connections to the California ISO's WEIM. And if we go to my slide, that's available. Great. So there you are, and I'm going to be presenting on 2 topics about operational improvements. And I actually believe Meg McNall already mentioned these in one of her last slides. So that's good news that it's been picked up, but I still would like to go over this briefly and give everyone a rundown. So next slide, please. So in history with BPA and the WEIM, BPA joined in May of 2022. We have 18 adjacent BAAs, 13 are WEIM entities, and 14 if you include the California ISO. So BPA is currently the submitting entity for all base ETSRs with all adjacent WEIM entities, and as well as the mirrors for the California ISO. So BPA has WEIM transfers with 11 other entities, and we've also presented on this proposal twice already. So next slide, please. So base ETR submissions don't always go through for us. So on a handful of occasions since go live, BPA has been unable to submit or update the base ETSR schedules or the pre-hour RTSI information for 1 or more hours. So these reasons vary. We can't have 100% uptime. So sometimes there are data integration issues, sometimes there are hosted vendor outages, sometimes there are difficulties with the WEIM that cause us to have the recommendation to exit the market, and that causes those base ETSRs not to be submitted for multiple hours afterward. So numerous enhancements have been made and improvements for reliability and stability of the systems. So these events will still occur no matter how hard we work. That last 1% is going to be difficult. So these issues aren't unique, but given the number of EIM adjacencies to BPA, they are significant when they occur. Next slide, please. So currently, the WEIM can only support one entity to be the submitting party for base ETSRs. That is BPA, like I mentioned. So when that submitting party is unable to perform that role, we see these impacts. So one of them is a degradation of WEIM's view of impacted BAA's power balance. Another would be potential deployment regulation of energy ABC or ACE impacts to the affected BAA. A third is inaccurate imbalanced settlements and difficulty shadowing market results, which would then result in after the fact settlement disputes for everyone. Next slide, please. Oh, looks like I had some animation on here that kept. So next, I highlighted this well. I wanted to make sure it was pinpointed. So these imbalances are important. Next slide. And I think there's one more. Okay, one more after that. Thank you. So the question is, what solution do we employ for this? Not just for BPA and the adjacents, but for any entity that's the submitting party. So we want this to be a long-term solution. We have one current recommendation is that all entities, so next slide, it should animate. All entities submit and the RTMO selects which data set to use. Then every entity is submitting their base ETSRs and the RTMO is selecting who is the priority at that point. Next slide, please. So for this option, like I said, every entity is going to submit that base ETSR schedule and the RTMO is selecting that submittal to use. So benefits of this are is it's providing redundant feed of data. So not only are we getting the one entity that's submitting, we also get information from every other BA and we can see which data is incorrect. So we get better resiliency and accuracy of the data in the WEIM. So by having multiple parties submit, we can compare those in real time and afterwards to see where the issues might lie. Also, it allows the RTMO to identify submittal discrepancies and contact entities as appropriate to resolve those issues as opposed to waiting until after the fact. The cons I put here are all really one problem, which is this is a robust procedure. It requires software enhancement, both with California ISO and possibly other entities to make this happen. But I believe that the benefits are worth the effort there. Next slide, please. So currently, we don't have that solution in place. So what BPA has done to mitigate this is we make sure impacted entities are informed of these events in as timely a manner as possible when it's critical. So BPA has also worked with the RTMO to create a Northwest Everbridge group consisting of all of BPA's adjacent EIM entity BAAs. So when there is a problem, all of them are informed. So BPA has also added internal procedures to make sure the loss of base ETSR scheduling is clearly communicated to the RTMO and then all other impacted entities utilizing that Northwest Cyberbridge group. Next slide, please. So in conclusion, BPA has presented on this topic twice already. We are seeking a long-term and robust solution. Even though BPA has worked to reduce downtime and mitigate instances and add communication to mitigate consequences for other affected entities, these short-term interim solutions should be considered and helpful, but we do need a long-term solution. Okay, next slide. I'll just move into my next topic, unless there are questions. Okay.
David, just a short question.
Yeah.
Are either of those earlier, I think there's a typo in the date, but
yes, there was a typo in the date.
Yeah, but are either
I apologize.
of those
We
public
haven't
presentations
presented
available?
in December of 2024 yet.
Not yet, but you will.
Still time.
Are either of those, are there links to those that you would be able to share?
Yes, I could share the links to the previous presentations. I think they're in the meeting notes from the meetings where it was presented.
Perfect. Thank you.
Of course. And I see a question from Dan. I don't know if that's directed at me or I guess it's directed to Amelia. So if everyone's okay, I'll continue on with my next topic, which is EIM transfer default limits. So the current WEIM default EIM transfer limit is 99999. So currently both source and sink BAs submit separate limits and the WEIM enforces the lowest limit. BPA submits limits that are consistent with our transmission rights made available and the supporting E-tags. So any failure by submitting entities, any kind of outage or data failure, results in CAISO using this default that has numerous impacts. So limits of that default are in excess of physical ability of the transmission system to support transfers, and those limits are in excess of the transmission rights on the dynamic E-tags supporting those EIM transfers. So next slide, please. So this is simple. By establishing a default limit of 0, so similar to when a breaker fails, you want it to fail open and not fail at maximum current. So if some entities prefer, we could have a non-zero default, but not something so high. So these problems we experience would be avoided and ensure the WEIM does not produce transfers that aren't either physically or commercially infeasible. So BPA first requested this enhancement in March of 2022, which was prior to our go live. And there is an example I put of August of 2022 when CAISO, the California ISO, had a problem processing those limits. And that was due to internal WEIM software failures, and that had a large impact on all entities in the market. So it's impossible to have 100% perfection and 100% uptime. So if we have default limits that are within the realm of reasonability and safety, it's going to improve the system for everyone. Next slide, please. Which is the conclusion I just said. Default dynamic ETSR limits should be set to a value that is safe when defaults are used. Thank you.
Thank you. Are there any questions? Seeing none, if we could switch to the next slide and another presentation from BPA. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, David. David just covered the operational enhancement proposal from BPA. I'm going to go over the settlement enhancement proposal. And after me, Bruce McAllister is going to cover a outage management enhancement. Next slide, please. Okay, our first proposal for settlement enhancement is to assess and improve CAISO's practices regarding resolving settlement issues or disputes. Currently, CAISO requires the price correction request to be submitted within 5 calendar days after the operating days. So operational issue can often be very complicated. It could be like software issue or integration issue, could be human error, or it could be even CAISO's issues or other entities issues. So it takes time to investigate, to figure out the root cause, and to be able to properly identify if there's any settlement impact. On top of that, the old settlement timeline provide a T+3 business day and T+7 business day settlement. So an entity at least has some data within 5 days to review to give us some indication there's some issue and then there's a settlement impact. With the current new settlement timeline, settlements are not available until 9 business days. So currently that 5-day requirement does not allow enough time for the entity to review the settlement statements and to be able to perform data analysis and figure out the need for price correction. This is especially difficult when issue happened during the weekend. Once out of the weekend where you lost 2-3 business days to be able to investigate. One of the examples of how this is impacting BPA, last year in March, when CAISO has software issues that cause all our TIDs and ghosts and mirrors to be incorrect. BPA did not discover what was happening until it was outside of 5 days window. So we were not able to request price correction. So we would like to assess and improve CAISO's practices regarding resolving settlement issues or disputes, allowing price adjustment to be more than 5 days after operating day. Ideally, we would like to have this window to be longer. 15 days will be ideal. This align with the settlement 9 business day settlement statement availability. So once we get a settlement statement, we would like to have a week to review the settlement data and then go back to investigate all other data. This will help us to be able to identify the settlement impact and then have an opportunity to request price correction if needed. Any question for me before I move on to the next settlement enhancement proposal?
Just for clarity, this is a request to extend the price correction request window and the price correction window, not to change the settlement timeline. Thank you.
Correct. So we're proposing that price correction window to be extended from 5 days to 15 days after the operating day. All right. You're welcome. Next slide, please. Okay. The second proposal is to review policies and practices regarding resolution of adjusting market and settlement related financial outcomes. When we have any issues, especially system and data issues, this can result in inappropriate or anomalous market outcomes. Usually price correction is almost always the only approach to adjust settlement after these system and data issues and failures. Volume correction is seldom granted because of the complexity of rerunning the market and getting these data to the system. So this makes the settlement adjustment become ineffective. So we do understand the desire to avoid the very complex work that involving, going back to the market solution and figure out what would have been different if those values had been in place. And usually that's the reason CAISO usually reject the request to adjust volume, but there should be some middle ground. So BPA would like to see CAISO working with BAs to come up with some solution that provides an opportunity to make things right. Here we have an alternative settlement adjustment method. This could be, say, if an entity submitted an incorrect base ETSR that resulted in a change in a charge and credit. But both entities agreed that the ETSR submitted data was wrong. CAISO could develop practices to move the money around as a settlement adjustment between the BAs without rerunning the market. Currently, we don't have any details about how the money should be moved around, but we just like to have a starting point here to have a conversation and work with CAISO to find some alternative solution. Any question for me? Hearing
Again, for clarity, if you could let me restate what it is that you're proposing and then let me know if I've got it wrong. You are proposing that in dealing with settlement-related disputes, the CAISO work with VAs for an alternative dispute resolution.
it's not a
process.
dispute. It's say when the incorrect base schedule somehow got submitted to CAISO due to system and data issues. The market, financial outcomes become inappropriate. And we like to work with CAISO to find a way to adjust the settlement outcome. So it's not about the settlement calculation is incorrect, so we need to file a dispute. It's more of a data got submitted to CAISO become incorrect because of any system and data issues.
Issues with the input data flowing into the settlement.
Correct.
Seeing any questions on the line?
All right. Thanks, everyone. I'm going to hand this over to Bruce. He's going to cover the outage management enhancement.
Bruce?
Hey, Bruce, check your audio.
You can unmute on the WebEx.
All right, can you hear me now?
We can
Hello?
indeed.
Bruce,
Thank
yeah,
you.
we can hear you.
Oh, great. Awesome. Yeah. All right, let's get to that one single outage slide, please. All right. Basically, this slide involves, outages remaining in pending state. And, I've submitted an awful lot of outages, into the ISO, during my time in the EIM. And I will tell you from experience, you don't normally go back and look at those outages in WebOMS to make sure that they got approved. You just kind of assume they are. And, that's happened a couple times here at BPA. So basically, this slide is, and we, brought this up before a few times in the past as well. But this outage approval process involves manual approval that introduces delay in updating the outage data customers, which does considerably impede outage processing. So we'd be curious if these kind of pending to approved state delays are associated with you guys running outage studies, and do you run studies on every outage submission or change? And basically, outages remaining in the pending state leads to outdated outage data and outage conflicts and delays in processing new outage entries. You know, historically, when we've seen what's going on, you know, we just call the RTMO, say, hey, could you guys take a look at this one outage? It's in a pending state. We need to approve. We're trying to make updates to a, you know, a new outage, you know, within the same time frame. And, you know, after a little while, you know, it gets fixed, but it does cause delays, especially when, you know, just from my experience, you know, if you submit an outage in the forward planning horizon and it intercedes with a new outage that you have, you know, you get an outage conflict and it takes a while to approve. So be interested to what your ideas on that are and any color around, you know, when and how, you know, you move outages from pending to approved state. But at a minimum, we're hoping outage cancellations could be auto-approved. That seems to be some low-hanging fruit for this type of thing. And that's it. You know, that's our big ask is to take a hard look at an improved, you know, outage, you know, review process.
Thank you. There is a hand raised from Kathleen Colbert.
Great, thank you. Can you hear me? It's Kathleen Colbert from Vistra.
Yep.
We can hear you.
Okay, great, thank you. No, thanks for presenting this. Thanks for putting this forward, presenting it. I wanted to both support you and let you know that, so the CAISO has invited us to present on outage management improvements next week. 15th? I'll be ready, I promise. Anyway, next Wednesday. So we're going to go through and also propose an outage management improvement initiative. It was in both the independent power producer and marketer submission and Vistra's. It's been framed as a storage improvement, outage management improvement, and that's probably more a function of the fact that with so many new storage assets coming online and us gaining so much experience, like we're finding lots of pain points in the outage management process, which I think is useful. But I hear you raising another one, and I just wanted to connect the dots that, you know, one of the specific issues that I'll describe next week also has to do with approvals. Manual approvals versus automatic approvals, actually on forced outages, timeframes. Was kind of our focus. So I'll take yours back and also think about it. But I wanted to connect the dots for the CAISO team that we're talking about the exact same application, OMS, and we're talking about very similar logic or business requirements that you're proposing and what we're going to present next week as well. So both support you and kind of emphasize maybe there's a pathway for a more general outage management initiative, and we could kind of combine some of these things and get some synergies.
Oh, that's great. I'll make sure I have time open on my calendar to be in that meeting as well. So thanks for bringing that up.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Are there any other questions on the line? As Kathleen mentioned, we have another working workshop scheduled for next week. That will be on the 15th in the afternoon. It will cover some of the issues that were highlighted in the RIF report, including some of the related to calculation of the maximum import constraint, as well as a lot of the storage and new technology related issues, including outages, as Kathleen mentioned. So definitely stay tuned. As this meeting is, that meeting will be recorded and the presentations will also be available afterwards. If we could switch to the next, last call for questions, but if we could switch to the next slide. Okay. I will go ahead and do this presentation, but I wanted to note here, it's on behalf of a large group of currently participating WEIM BAAs, a number of whom have representatives on the phone here today. If you would like to, please do, essentially, feel free to raise your hand and add anything to the presentation today. I based this, the content of the slides to follow on the comments submitted by Idaho Power. Many of the other commenters cited the Idaho Power comments, and so theirs, but the entire set of comments is at the link included on the slide here. With that, we could go to the next slide. This is a proposal to introduce a new de minimis band. The enhancement would create a de minimis band in case of a failure of the RSE, a small de minimis amount, such as 10 megawatts or less, the entity would not be deemed to have failed and could still participate in the EIM. For background here, the resource, as I think on this call you are all very familiar, the resource sufficiency evaluation is a set of tests. In each case, these are tests where there is a requirement that is constructed and then a way of meeting that requirement that's also constructed. And this is a proposal that the relatively minor failures be treated differently or ignored. The next comment is that such de minimis failures are insignificant and should not cause reliability concerns if they actually materialize. This de minimis band would be similar to the RSE Tier 1 failure thresholds in EDAM. Slide. Proposed initiatives are not in response to regulatory requirements. This was an answer to one of the questions we asked for in comments. It aligns with EDAM market design. And the consequences of not addressing this is that it may result in, essentially, it may result in failures of the RSE by these de minimis amounts, which would have the consequences of failure of an RSE test, which would restrict access to EIM transfers. And at times when the entities opted into the AET program, might result in unnecessary financial penalties for small, non-material failure amounts. Next slide. Right. Are there any comments on this proposal? Just highlight here, this had broad support from a number of different entities in the comments and is similar to a provision in, yeah. With that, ooh, Dan Williams.
Dan Williams from the Energy Authority. Hi, Amelia. This is Dan Williams from the Energy Authority. Just to make sure I understand better here, without making this change, the de minimis threshold would be implemented just in the EDAM day-ahead RSE, but then to the extent that there were either still entities in EIM that were not in EDAM or I guess in certain circumstances where, I'm remembering the policy correctly, where an EDAM RSE was failed, not cured by the pool, and an entity was subject to the EIM RSE, without this change, we'd still sort of have this issue persisting in EIM even after EDAM's implemented?
Correct.
Okay.
That's
And
correct. So it's a request for consistency between the two.
Okay. That kind of brings me to a general sort of question or comment that I wanted to make kind of back when you were setting this up, and maybe this will give time for Gridwell to get their presentation pulled up. But within our consideration of these initiatives, I always sort of have in mind what is the cost of each of them. And maybe for the next working group, it would be helpful if the ISO could share some of their thinking on how stakeholders should think about that as well. And what's coming to mind for me is just that any of these initiatives have to get run through an implementation assessment internal to the CAISO for like called a IT cost perspective, but also then just sort of generally, I'm assuming, get run through an assessment on the front end of the ISO developing its budget each year. And to the extent that, you know, there's a certain amount of staff and IT resources and a certain amount of budget dollars for policy work available that can get divvied up each year, it feels like it would be important to know kind of for each of the proposals some sort of an estimate of what the cost is, to see where that fits in with an overall, you know, bundle of resources that can be allocated. Some of that too may be an assessment of the legal work that has to get done, just how much of a lift it is to do the tariff changes involved with any of them, and potentially maybe the durability of the work that's done, sort of how long it provides benefit within the market. Does that make sense to an extent, or is that something that could be kind of discussed further in the future?
Yeah, thanks for bringing that up. The input we would really appreciate from stakeholders is the in-market, the overall efficiency-related costs and benefits of making a change, the reliability effect of making the change. The implementation cost will be assessed by the ISO for each of the discretionary initiative proposals. It takes a certain amount of effort to do the implementation assessment itself, as I'm sure you appreciate. We were hoping, and if we had had a small handful of proposals, we were hoping that we could do a relatively high-level implementation cost assessment of all of the proposals that came in, to really allow stakeholders to kind of consider that implementation cost themselves. Unfortunately, we got over 150, and it just hasn't been possible. For a rough scaling, the implementation cost associated with changes to the tariff is higher than changes to the BPM in terms of the regulatory support. In terms of implementation cost itself, the number of system changes requires not only the cost of the ISO and making those system changes, but also often for market, there's a cost to market participants as well if they need to change their systems. Some of these proposals are relatively light and wouldn't impact very much. So to the degree possible, with a relatively small list, I believe that the November-December roadmap will include some high-level implementation cost assessment. But the result of the stakeholders' ranked priorities doesn't need to consider that. It should be the high priority items for stakeholders.
Okay. Yeah, that's helpful. So what I'm hearing in that is just as stakeholders, we should advocate for what we think will have the most benefit in the market, what's most critical to adjust. And then, the ISO will, through its process, then sort of do the weighting between the criticality of those against sort of what you're able to assess for costs internally. And then as we that gets winnowed down to a smaller number of initiatives, you'd be able to sort of share how some of that came out. I guess just kind of on a going forward basis, then we'll sort of learn as stakeholders as we go through this each year, sort of start to get a heuristic feeling for how much different efforts cost in terms of time and IT and all that kind of stuff. But I guess the request is just to, wherever it's possible, to share that decision-making framework that you're going through internally as you're developing the draft budget and looking at what's going on in discretionary, non-discretionary. Just if there's anything you can share with us, I think it'll help improve our ability to at least have a reasonable understanding for the cost of something we might be asking for. But thank you.
Thank you. I will hand it off to the representatives of the IPP. Thank you very much.
Carrie, you're currently muted.
Am I unmuted now? Hi, this is Carrie.
Yep, we can hear you. Thanks.
Perfect. Hi, everyone. This is Carrie Bentley with the Western Power Trading Forum. I am co-founder and CEO of Gridwell Consulting. Today, I'm here representing the RIF IPP sector. On this particular topic, the Western Power Trading Forum and the IPP sector are aligned. Our membership, however, crosses over multiple RIF sectors. And so it's only on this topic we want to emphasize that our interests are aligned. Oftentimes we find members supporting all sorts of different policy prioritization and different proposals. So I only have 4 slides. It'll be very quick. Oh, you guys can't see me. Hold on. Can you see me now? No?
It doesn't look like your video's on yet, no.
Huh. All.
I can hear you.
You can hear me. That's the important part. All right. So I only have 4 slides, so that's very easy. First, I'm going to do an overview slide on the impact of limiting economic intertie bidding. So economic intertie bidding is a typical feature of ISO markets around the country and around the world. Generally, you allow economic intertie bidding as opposed to self-scheduling or bilateral trades because it allows more efficient scheduling and dispatches of resources around different seams. As you heard from David when he was talking about BPA, typically when people think of seams, they think of 1 or 2 seams, but as you saw from his slide, many of the WEAM entities have large amounts of seams that they are going to have to handle moving forward, particularly as we move into an EDAM world. Today, each WEAM entity has the option to enable economic intertie bidding or not. The CAISO yields this authority to each entity, but none have done so far. In our mind, intertie bidding increases the market's ability to optimize both transmission and resources. It improves open access, so non-discriminatory access to both transmission and markets, and it reduces seams inefficiencies. WPTF is fairly concerned about seams these days, as are multiple entities, and that's because in the near future, the West is going to have so many more seams than we've ever had to deal with before. We'll have EDAM to non-EDAM seams, we'll have EDAM to SPP Markets Plus seams, and then we'll have seams between these entities and BAAs outside both markets. And then these entities will have economic decisions that they're going to make about interacting with both markets. So suddenly we have this plethora of incentives and potential for inefficiencies that we haven't faced yet in the West. So what we are most concerned about is efficiency, because trading between markets is already challenging. And now when you're talking about interacting between different BAs with different rules and entirely different cost allocation structures and pricing mechanisms, trading suddenly becomes a lot less efficient and a lot more challenging. And then if you don't allow economic bidding, it also limits trade. And so then this will undermine the benefits of going to these market structures in the first place. A little bit of background on our position. WPTF has long supported intertie bidding at the market boundaries, including during the WEAM implementation process. Again, things that are vital to WPTF. We're a nonprofit trade organization dedicated to competition and transparency. So we care about open access to market participation. We care about market efficiency and the effective use of both generation and transmission. And then we also really care about the incentives for voluntary external supply offers. And this is important in our mind to both California and to the entire WEAM and ultimately EDAM footprint. The CAISO, just some terminology now, CAISO intertie points are interfaces between the CAISO balancing area and external balancing areas. And this is true in IFM, HASP, 15-minute, 5-minute. So it's just those intertie points between the CAISO balancing area and other ones. And then you have non-CAISO WEAM BAA external interties. And these are interfaces between a WEAM entity BAA and a balancing area that's not participating in WEAM. So the rules today, the CAISO allows economic bidding on the CAISO intertie points, but the decision to allow economic bidding at the non-CAISO WEAM BAs, so that point between the non-CAISO WEAM BAA and the WEAM entity BAA, that is deferred to the WEAM entity. So what we're asking for is for the CAISO to consider the value proposition of mandating economic intertie bidding, at least, ramping through EDAM. WPTF supports it through EDAM and WEAM. We note that the RIF sector, the IPP RIF sector, is more focused on EDAM. So intertie bidding, however, at both EDAM and WEAM boundaries would provide additional market liquidity and optimization benefits. It really does allow for an incentivized increased supply to be offered into EDAM. This is the RIF IPP sector particular concern and incentive in trying to get this into the policy catalog. So our large concern is that in the future, a few years down the road from now, without intertie economic bidding in EDAM, excess energy from resources that are not in EDAM, that are not in Markets Plus, will be more incented to offer that energy into Markets Plus because their design is going to allow for economic intertie bidding. So there could be some incentives in play, and it seems like we should consider the value of updating our rules upfront far in advance of the implementation of both of those markets. And we also believe that it'll help address potential seams issues where ultimately we'll have a seam between EDAM and Markets Plus. If there was an ability to exchange supply economically between those two markets, we believe that it would benefit not just EDAM, but also Markets Plus. And that should be something that both ISOs, RTOs are incented to do. And then finally, we want to acknowledge the challenges of this and why this didn't go forward to begin with. Economic bidding at interties, it doesn't exist because the WEAM future EDAM entities were concerned about a few things. They were worried about transmission free riders. So, they paid for transmission and people get free access to it. They were worried about how you would do fair cost allocation to ensure that that free ridership doesn't happen, and then ensure that the different cost components were allocated fairly. And then they were also concerned about the certainty of intertie supply. That is, if you allow economic offers at the interties, how robust, how certain are you that the supply is actually going to show up when you need it? And so what we're asking for is for the CAISO to explore how to enable economic intertie bidding in both EDAM and WEAM. So our specific ask is for an initiative to not just mandate it, but explore how this would be possible, how entities outside the boundaries could participate economically by submitting bids. Would that be into the WEAM or EDAM? How you would allow for that efficient trading across the market seams and eventually between the SPP Markets Plus seam and our WEAM footprints. And then the effort should really be focused on, in our mind, figuring out what the concerns are of the non-CAISO EDAM WEAM entities, of the EDAM WEAM entities. Why did this not go forward in the first place? And is there anything we could do in the market design to alleviate these concerns and still get the benefits of efficient trade? And that's all I have. Thanks very much. I'll see if there's any questions.
Thank you, Carrie. I see a question from Dan Williams.
Hey, Carrie, Dan from TEA. Not a question, just a appreciation for you presenting this. And just to play a bit of historian, the first time this came up was in, I guess, when we were developing the year one enhancements in like 2015. In a FERC docket in 2016 that WPTF submitted a well done protest of what was filed at the time. But just reflecting that we're not too far off, and by the time EDAM's implemented, we'll be at a decade since this policy was litigated at FERC, and a lot has changed since then in terms of transparency, full network model. Just we know a lot more now than we did then, and I would really encourage the CAISO and stakeholders to sort of test some of the assumptions that went into the decision that was made almost a decade ago, and think about the importance of market efficiency and getting our markets to work better together, whether that's bilateral to EIM or future market-to-market options. But thanks for taking the time to walk through this today.
Thanks, Dan. I can't believe it's almost been a decade. When you said that, I was like, no, that's wrong. But you're right. It has been quite some time. That's a wonderful point.
Thank you. And then, Carrie, if you wouldn't mind sharing the slide deck, we can post it with the rest of the slides for this workshop session.
Yep,
Okay.
I already
clarifies.
Yeah.
Perfect. Perfect. And just to be absolutely crystal clear, the request here is for the CAISO to run a discretionary initiative that opens up for both the WEIM and EDAM participating BAs the option of allowing trades on their boundary that are non-EIM or non-WEIM, non-WEIM or non-EDAM trades, and explores the functionality of that as well as any sort of potential concerns those entities may have with that. Correct?
I think just one small clarification, and that's that optionality already exists because it is up to each entity, the WEAM entity right now. They could allow it if they wanted to per the CAISO tariff. So it's more exploring how you could transition to mandated economic bidding or something similar to that, maybe a glide path to a more concrete guide path for entities to be able to enact intertie economic bidding.
So a glide path to mandated.
Or a glide path that makes it, I think, easier and not just you could do it if you want, but there's no path forward right now. There's no incentive, there's no transparency around the benefits. I think the initiative could explore whether it's mandated or whether actually people are set up for success by moving forward in a more formalized process that just doesn't exist today.
I see a question from Kathleen Colbert.
Kathleen Colbert from Vistra. I wanted to support Carrie in kind of how, so Carrie, thank you for this presentation and walking through kind of this ask from this on behalf of the sector. We really appreciate that. If it's all right, to also kind of answer Amelia, your question, the way that I have heard, I'm not very close to this, but the way I have heard this particular issue is that under day ahead today, so when we're talking about options versus mandatory, I'd almost think of it more like a question on, is it prudent to allow economic trading at the border of your market footprint in the day ahead? As a design, almost all markets, almost if not all markets, do allow inter-tie trading at the seams of their market to another market, or to a non-regulated, or to a regulated area that's outside of a market. In our day ahead, we have that. We have inter-tie scheduling points around the border of our footprint where that inter-tie trading is allowed. With EDAM, that footprint will extend. And so the policy discussion that I think several entities want to have is, as that footprint expands, the outer edges of the footprint are moving outward from the CAISO's border. And so where is the actual like physical interconnection between the now EDAM footprint border and areas on the outside, those seams Carrie was talking about? So just to kind of elevate, the ask is to explore how, as the footprint expands, how intertie trading at that border would be facilitated. And that's less of a question of option or mandatory at every single BAA, and more a principled discussion about allowing access into a market footprint at its border. And then that would expand into WEAM once you would establish a policy associated with that trading. At least that's the simple way I've thought about it. And Carrie, happy to have you kind of correct or refine that, but that's how I've dumbed it down in my head.
I think that works. And then eventually the seams between the organized markets as well, enacting intertie trading on that. I think it all should be discussed. All right, Amelia.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And thank you to Meg as well. I did want to say both of you have summarized comprehensively and transparently an enormous amount of stakeholder information and feedback, and we really appreciate it.
Thank you for your active participation in this process. I think you do much of the same, so thank you, Carrie. All right, we are moving a little bit ahead of schedule, which should give everybody a little bit of time back. If you can go to the next slide. This is the first of two proposals from the Salt River Project. Unfortunately, the Salt River Project was not able to be here to present them today, but they are very fully documented in the proposals themselves. So thank you, Salt River Project, for submitting them. And with that, I'll go ahead and present the comments that they submitted for all of you. Next slide. This is a base scheduling below PMIN enhancement. PMIN is the minimum operating level for a resource, and SRP has submitted this, as many of you have noted multiple times, both for the 2022 catalog. In the spring of 2021, SRP participated in a market simulation to test the ability to submit base schedules below PMIN to account for startup energy. During the simulation, SRP worked with CAISO to identify the startup ramp time parameter specified in the generator resource data template, GRDT. That is the input for the CAISO's master file, which is the name of the database that stores resource level parameters, but that was not flexible enough to allow the use of warm and cold startups. Particularly here, they are pointing out the ramp time parameter. This parameter is required to be the same as or shorter than the hot startup time registered. Therefore, for warm or cold startups, this parameter does not represent the true startup ramp time required to get to PMIN. Stepping out of presenting SRP's proposal here, I will note that the ISO does have functionality to allow representation of different startup conditions, cold, warm, hot, and the relevant characteristics of those, but the gap that SRP is pointing out here is particularly for the startup ramp time differences, which are used then in the base schedule. Next slide, please. Test results from market simulation indicated that base scheduling below PMIN for additional hours beyond the startup ramp time would be unexpected by the market. And startups would therefore not be scheduled. And again, the proposal states that the startup time was limited to the fastest hot time, and that any startup exceeding that time would not be scheduled. The internal EOT dispatch operating target would then be 0 for the hours beyond the duration of the startup ramp time. A solution to this would be to allow for the submission of hot, warm, and cold startup ramp time parameters, GRDT. There's other possible options as well. Next slide. This initiative aims to enhance
Hey, we just lost audio for Amelia. Alyssa, would you like to go ahead and take over?
Good. And Amelia, let me know if your audio is working again. All right. This initiative aims to enhance the market's flexibility in scheduling startup energy and ensure that the market's internal dispatch operating targets reflect actual unit capabilities by modifying the generator resource data template, GRDT, to include separate parameters for hot, warm, and cold startup ramp times, and allowing for base scheduling below PMIN to accurately represent different startup conditions and ensure resources are dispatched efficiently according to their operational capabilities. Next slide, please.
Back, Alyssa.
All right, thanks, Amelia.
Thank you. As requested in the comment template, Salt River Project pointed out that this particular initiative would support a number of the ISO's different objectives. And these, again, were presented in an earlier workshop, but it would support Objective 1, enhancing operational capabilities. Objective 2, strengthening resource adequacy. Objective 3, expanding market opportunities. And 4, improving stakeholder engagement. The first would be enhancing operational capabilities by accurately capturing startup energy needs, directly enhancing the CAISO's capability to integrate resources with varying startup requirements. Second would be by enabling precise scheduling of units based on their startup type. This initiative supports CAISO's resource adequacy goals. It ensures that all available resources can be effectively utilized, contributing to grid reliability. Objective 3, expanding the market opportunities by accommodating diverse startup conditions, expanding markets across a variety of generation resources, particularly combined cycle units, enhancing market depth and operational efficiency. Finally, Objective 4, it addresses this technical limitation, demonstrating CAISO's commitment to stakeholder feedback and collaborative market enhancements, encouraging a more inclusive and responsive market development process. Next slide. Again, the mention of regulatory mandates was responsive to a question we asked. The urgency for implementing this initiative stems from the need to align market operations with the practical realities of generating unit startups. The resolution of this issue could continue to hinder the efficient integration of resources, particularly those with variable startup times, potentially impacting grid reliability and increasing operational costs. Immediate action is recommended to ensure the operational flexibility needed for efficient grid management, particularly for units that face scheduling challenges under the current GRDT constraints. Further, SRP appreciates the CAISO's previous commitment to enable base scheduling below PMIN. However, its effectiveness is currently limited for multiple resources due to existing operational constraints. This initiative is intended to address these limitations and ensures the ability to schedule below PMIN is available to fulfill the CAISO's commitment. Next slide. If you could go back one. Are there any questions at all on this proposal? While I'm waiting for questions, I'll in answer to sort of an example of an answer to Dan Williams's earlier question about looking at the implementation cost. This is an example of an initiative that appears to affect a very narrow, it appears to be a narrow change, but could potentially, require changes in not only the GRDT, could potentially require changes in the software that validates base schedules, potentially also in a number of the other software. But compared to, for example, the proposal that Carrie was discussing earlier, which would require an entire stakeholder process, would require a large discussion about allowing intertie bidding for balancing authorities that don't currently do that. This initiative is relatively focused and minor. Change to an existing process. Okay, if you go to the next slide, this is the last initiative we'll be discussing today, which is accounting for upward transition costs in settlements after economic commitments to lower configuration. This again, I need to thank Salt River Project for submitting such a complete set of comments. I will be presenting what they submitted, only adding a little bit of context where I think it's helpful for understanding. Next slide. This initiative was submitted by SRP for the 2022 catalog and is being resubmitted for 2023. A recent case was identified where a MSG multi-stage generator was base scheduled in an upper configuration, but was then instructed to transition to a lower configuration per an economic commitment from the WEIM. Due to a long minimum downtime and transition time, the short-term unit commitment did not identify the need to transition back up to the higher configuration shortly after the horizon. So to do a little bit of translation here, although I think most of you on the call are familiar with this, multi-stage generator is typically a combined cycle, although there can be others that has multiple configurations. Say one common setup is to have two CTs and a steam turbine, for example. This is what SRP is identifying here is a case where the market was economically transitioning from a higher configuration to a lower configuration, but was then, due to the resource level constraints, the minimum uptime, was not able to issue a market commitment through the short-term unit commitment process, the ISO's real-time commitment engine, to the higher configuration. This has cost implications. If you go to the next slide, I think I'll explain. The unit met its minimum downtime, but didn't stay in that lower configuration much longer. The transition cost was then not accounted for in the market decision to move back to the upper configuration in a subsequent market run, because the unit continued to be base scheduled in the upper configuration. What SRP is pointing out here is that in the WEIM, which does not have a day-ahead market, they're submitting base schedules. In cases where the market is transitioning an MSG resource to a lower configuration, the market will not then transition that resource potentially back up to its base schedule because it sees it as in the base scheduled higher configuration already. It is SRP's understanding that this transition cost is also not accounted for in bid cost recovery or other settlements processes, even though it is the direct result of the market decision to transition to the lower configuration. Bid cost recovery is the ISO's make whole payment, which does allow resources who are committed by the market to operate at a certain level to recover their costs if those costs are not recovered within the market. SRP is pointing out here a case in which, because their economic transition away from their base schedule was downward, their upward transition cost is not included in the calculation of their overall market cost for bid cost recovery. One solution might be to keep the transition cost out of the market optimization decision, but later account for it in the BCR process. In the event the unit does not recover its cost for following the transition instruction. So their proposal is to adjust the bid cost recovery calculation only. Next slide. This initiative seeks to ensure fair compensation for transition costs resulting from market instructions by, 1, introducing a settlement adjustment to account for costs associated with transitioning between configurations as directed by the market. 2, modifying the bid cost recovery process or similar settlement mechanisms to include transition costs not recovered due to market optimized commitments to lower configurations. Next slide. As before, they diligently noted that this supports a number of ISO objectives. Acknowledging transition costs and settlements enhances market operational integrity by ensuring that the costs associated with market-directed actions are accurately accounted for, compensated. This initiative indirectly supports resource adequacy by ensuring that resources are not economically disincentivized from following market instructions, therefore maintaining their availability and operational flexibility. Expands market opportunities by addressing settlement discrepancies. This initiative promotes fair market participation, ensuring that all operational costs are recognized, thereby encouraging broader participation from diverse resources. And finally, this initiative demonstrates a commitment to address stakeholder concerns regarding market fairness and transparency, fostering a collaborative environment for continuous improvement. Next slide. There are no explicit regulatory deadlines for addressing this initiative. However, this timely rectification is critical for maintaining market fairness and participant trust. The absence of a solution to this issue may lead to financial disincentives for compliance with market instructions, risking the efficient functioning of the market and potentially leading to reliability concerns over time. Immediate consideration is warranted to prevent financial loss for participants adhering to market instructions, ensuring that operational decisions are economic. And with that, I will see if there are any questions. A question from Kathleen Colbert.
Kathleen, your line is unmuted. You can go ahead.
Thank you, Kathleen Colbert from Vistra. Thanks for walking through that for SRP, Amelia. I appreciate that. It would be interesting to have more of a conversation with them on what they proposed at some point. So for the purpose of like going through what had previously been submitted to the catalog, the IPP marketer sector like went through it and did an assessment on what was still like a live issue versus should be removed, and then kind of prioritize those within it. So this particular one, we did keep in what we agree is still an issue. It's number 31, and it has a different name. We called it Bid Cost Recovery and a 15-minute Market Startup Initiative. And the reason for that, and this is why I think more conversation is warranted, is that this is a very, very targeted problem statement, but there's a more general way to look at this and to look at it from the perspective of, are there instances in the real-time market bid cost recovery where bid cost recovery is not being included for instances in which the real-time market makes advisory decision and then unwinds that in the final binding decision. That was how we understood kind of like their underlying premise, right? Is that it doesn't show up in the BCR because it's actually become a binding impact on the market. And when we discussed it, we could see other scenarios that might fall into this bucket. So we kept their example of the issue on minimum load energy or transition and like not being included, but we also suggested expanding it to looking at storage scenarios where there might be a change from the advisory results into the binding results, and then additional BCR enhancements that could potentially address those. And so I just wanted to point you in that direction and also encourage maybe some additional discussion on this before you finalize how you would represent it in a catalog.
Thank you for pointing that out, Kathleen. I will use a slightly different example here, but at the last working group, there was a robust discussion around congestion revenue rights. Our working assumption for the way that we're going to ask for prioritization is that we would ask stakeholders to rank an initiative proposing to look at potentially reform the congestion revenue rights, both allocation and auction process broadly, rather than ask for individual as submitted initiatives. We would then also let people express their support for all of the proposals in that category. So I really appreciate you bringing that up, because I think this is a case where this is a particular market commitment occurring for a participant that is active in the real-time market only, that is highlighting where there's some potentially market-driven costs that aren't being recovered through the market that is coming because they are dealing with having to base schedule their resource. So appreciate you bringing that up, and I will definitely try to ensure that we tie these together.
Thank you.
Yeah. Any other comments? Okay, I will hand it off to, I believe the next slide is for Brenda.
Thank you. So we do have that notice that just went out announcing next week we will have a meeting on the 15th. I'll make sure if you could come and attend that meeting, that'll be great. It's scheduled in the afternoon. Also, feel free to visit the stakeholder recurring website. We do post these slides, and we'll be posting a few more that were shown today. At the next slide, you can go ahead and show, Silas. It's for the stated date for the Stakeholder Symposium. We have plans to have that registration site up and running in the next coming weeks. We appreciate everyone's patience, and then we will be announcing more about the sponsorship opportunities. And then the next slide is that the ISO will be launching in CAISO.com in late May. We also have May 23rd and May 29th have training sessions to help our stakeholders be informed about the new website. And so it's, I've been at one training session. It's been really great. The website's going to look pretty great. So look out for a daily briefing for details. So hopefully this will help with transparency in a lot of areas that we have had the meetings. And so everything's going to look a better format. So we definitely appreciate the feedback we've received thus far. At this time, I don't have other announcements for this meeting, but we look forward to seeing you at the next meeting on May 15th at 1 p.m. Pacific time. And I'll pass it back to Silas, our event producer.
With that, the call is now concluded. Thank you all so much for joining, and thank you to all of our speakers and attendees. With that, the call is concluded and you may disconnect.